Rachel Lampard, welcome to Hope and Anchor. Welcome to our virtual pub table. It's lovely to have you with us today.
Oh, it's lovely to be here, Trey. Thank you.
We like to imagine that we are at a pub table together having a conversation about things that delight us, things that challenge us. We'd like to ask all of our guests as we sit down at the table just to let us know, where are you in the world and what is your local? That could be your local coffee shop or your local school governor's meeting or your local cafe or bar, wherever it is you go on a regular basis in your community to hang out with friends and make new ones. So Rachel Lampard, where are you in the world and what's your local?
Um, where I am is Walthamstow in East London, Northeast London, which is a fabulous place to be. It's very diverse. It's a very creative place, and it's really near Epping Forest, which is fantastic. I think the forest might actually be one of the places that I go. Might be my local. I don't have a dog. Which is one of the ways of making conversation. But I have got children, and they're another way of making friends and having conversations with people. So yeah, perhaps hanging out in the forest, meeting friends. There, we've definitely been meeting friends during lockdown, but having conversations with people as well.
Right. Do you actually meet people, like meet new friends in the forest while you're walking along?
Well,
Maybe
yeah,
kids
sometimes
help with that.
people when they're young, kids help with that. They're a little bit older now, but yeah, people are quite chatty often, particularly if you get stuck in the mud and funny
I
things
love that.
happen to you. Yeah, it's all good.
Super. We went walking in Epping Forest at some point during lockdown. It was my
Uh-huh.
first time there, and it's vast, isn't it? It's just
Yeah,
vast. Yeah.
yeah. It was very full during lockdown, though. I think kind of most of London and Essex went into Epping Forest. But no, it's a lovely place, and I can still get totally lost,
Oh,
which is always a good sign.
wonderful to get lost, even in
Yeah.
your own city. So you have quite a CV. I was looking online at your CV, your resume. You have been a leader in justice and peace and public policy issues for the better part of, I was counting in your adult life, 3 decades, with the last 20 working with a national group of Christian churches working together to make a difference. Now leading the Methodist Church and a major social justice project. You were vice president of the Methodist Conference in 2016. In your spare time, besides like with your partner raising children, you also are an advocate for the prevention of gambling harm and were awarded an MBE in 2016 for services to the regulation of gambling. That's quite a CV. Well done, you. I'm always curious. We could go online and read all about that and find out more information about you, but I'm always curious about why people do what they do, the why beneath the what. So when you're laying in bed at night, awake and conspiring for justice in the world, or when you're getting out of the bed in the morning to do it, what is it that actually gets you out of bed or keeps you awake at night, dreaming and conspiring?
Mm. I think the why is probably very deeply wired into kind of my childhood and who I am and who brought me up. So my parents, both my dad's Methodist minister, very much part of the Methodist Church, and my childhood was very much sitting at the kitchen table talking about politics and religion. So that's kind of the melting pot almost that brought me up, that made me think that these two were things that went together. And because of that, it was very normal, and we cared a lot. We always cared about all sorts of issues and concerns. We used to drink that Nicaraguan coffee that came in huge pots in the late 1970s, and into fair trade very early, going on marches and demonstrations. And so that's very much part of my childhood. Moving to London in the 1980s, I think was when it really hit me in terms of my personal role, my personal responsibility, was seeing the number of people who were sleeping rough and who were homeless. And remember having a very vivid experience walking down Oxford Street and just seeing somebody eating out of a bin and thinking, this is not right. And I think that was almost a kind of turning point for me, when it went from being a more kind of intellectual kind of concern to being, and this is where you need to go. So I think that's the kind of hardwire thing for me. The kind of the second turning point, as it were, came from a recognition that as well as helping the man in front of me. So I worked in kind of night shelters and day centres and things like that. It was this recognition. I think it was Emma Hardy who you had a couple of weeks ago, who was saying we can't just be putting out fires, we've got to stop the fires. I think somebody else said, we can't just pull people out of the stream, we've got to go upstream. So
Yeah.
what is this going upstream? So I felt very much called to this kind of going upstream and saying, why is somebody homeless? Why are we talking about these issues? Why are people hungry? Why are people lonely? And looking at the justice stuff from a structural point of view. So I think that's the thing that keeps me going, gets me out of bed. It is this mixture of the seeing the impact, but then the need to go upstream and ask the difficult questions and
I
the
love that.
asking why, but all very much rooted in a childhood where I was growing from the church, and the church is my family. And having been fortunate enough to work for the church for the last 20 years, yeah, I feel very fortunate to be part of this family, to be doing this as part of my calling, and to be doing it here.
Yeah, you are fortunate, and we are fortunate to have you working that way. I want to get into the conversation around justice in a little bit, but I'm curious about that. Your own family table, your family of origin, you growing up, and you talking about, we say, what are the things you should never mention in a family meal? Politics, religion, and sex, or death,
Yeah,
or
don't
cancer.
think
I
we
think of
talked
the other
about sex
things.
very much.
Yeah. But you talked about politics and religion. And that was young Rachel back in the 70s at your parents' table talking about. So it became sort of a norm. And then the light switches that went on for you in your adolescence and early 20s. I'm just curious, you're raising children right now. And I'm thinking about, for folks who are watching Hope and Anchor, who may be your age, our age, or younger, and raising children, and they want their children to be children who seek the good, who seek the common good and seek justice. Could you just share a little bit about how you, maybe at your family table, or how you as a family have helped your own children or children in your church sort of take steps into that?
Not done it perfectly, and really keen to keep learning from my grandchildren when they come along. In some ways, my kids have had a very different upbringing, in that they've grown up in London in the 2010s, 2020s, and I think what schools are doing now is very different, and their awareness, their education as being citizens is far greater. So I think they have almost a bit of a head start. I think what youth groups are doing, what kids are doing through 3Generate, seeing themselves as agents of change, again, it is more available, more rooted. So as a parent sitting around the table, I've got much more of a head start. We can talk much more about the things that they've done in geography, or the things they're learning in citizenship, or what they might be doing in 3Generate in a couple of weeks' time. But beyond that, some of it is helping them to reflect on where they are, and what it is like. So when you go somewhere else and they suddenly realize that it's actually very white, and what it means to live in a very diverse area, and how fortunate we are. When they see somebody who's homeless, picking up the implications of climate change, and just allowing a bit of space for reflection and conversation, but then offering them opportunities to respond. Now, some of it maybe they go towards a fundraising things. They want to suddenly raise funds for anybody who's in the house towards water aid. Was one thing we had to raise £20 one afternoon from all the guests and relatives. But they've been on marches and demonstrations with me. They've all written letters to their MP knows them and she's lovely. But they've all done this. But it's helping them to see that there are ways for them to act in response to the things that they see, that they have a gut sense is not right. Sometimes they can do this at church as well. So as part of the young people's group, we've written letters through Amnesty International, and so we've reflected on it within a specifically faith context with them as well. So it is finding those opportunities both to reflect and then to act.
So I love that, a mix of small stuff, but it's so much so that it becomes sort of the oxygen in their lives, and they're getting it not just at your family table, but you're really fortunate that it's coming through schools and groups. So this becomes, this is the world they're living in and thinking about all the time, which is, it really is a change from when we were young, I think. That's wonderful. Let me shift gears a little bit here. And I was reading online, preparing for our conversation today. And full disclosure, I've known you for a little while, but I'd never read the address when you were elected vice president of the Methodist Conference. So you're speaking. You're one of the two major elected leaders for a year. For those of you who aren't Methodist, this is back in 2016. And in your address to the Methodist Conference, really to the whole Methodist Church, you quoted the prophet Amos from the Old Testament in the Bible. And you used a translation which is more modern. I'm going to just read a couple of lines. As you're addressing the whole Methodist Conference, you say, and this is Amos the prophet from like 800 BCE, so 2,800 years ago. And he's sort of channeling God. He's sort of like speaking for God. And Amos says, I can't stand your religious meetings. I'm fed up with your conferences and conventions. I want nothing to do with your religious projects. He goes on to say, I've had all I can take of your noisy ego music. When was the last time you sang to me, to God? Do you know what I want? I want justice, oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want. I mean, extremely compelling. What a choice to make, to speak to the Methodist Conference. And here you have this quote about like, so why did you choose that Bible verse?
Oh, it felt a bit risky.
I'll bet.
Yeah. Luckily, I think they loved me enough to let me get away with it. And it wasn't intended as a harsh criticism of what the Methodist Conference does at all. It was intended as a sharing of this vision, I think, that Methodists do hold for righteousness and justice, and this lovely image that Amos gives us of there being so much justice that it just bubbles over, it rolls over, and it washes everything clean. And the kind of message that Amos is, as you say, channeling God is giving is not to get this obsession with doing things kind of as the church, but actually to see the bigger picture, this bigger world that God invites us into. So I think that's where it was coming from, and it certainly led to a lot of conversations during the year. But it's a fantastic verse, and I hope it's one that's seen as inspiring rather than deeply critical of our church, because I think we are trying very hard.
Amen. I mean, it struck me as I was thinking about it. Amos received that message from God 2,800 years ago and was talking about God's vision for a world washed by justice. Here we are 2,800 years later. You are calling the church, many are calling the church and the world to justice. Are we any closer to the vision God had for the world 2,800 years ago? Are we farther away? What does it mean for you to be sort of in a line of, and all of us in a line of prophets that have been calling out for justice for a long time? What is it like to be connected to that strand of prophecy?
Gosh, that's a huge question. I think one initial thing I'd want to say is that I wouldn't want to claim to know where God's justice lies. I think we can get senses of it and glimpses of it and revelations of it. Sometimes we're closer, sometimes we're further away. Sometimes we're convinced we're right, and then we discover 100 years later that actually we've been completely wrong. And this time we think we're right. So each time I think it needs to be provisional. Because what we see so much about justice in the Bible. It's absolutely wonderful. We could probably talk for the next 45 minutes about that. But one of the things that we see, particularly in the New Testament, when Jesus is talking about it, is that it's really quite surprising. A lot of the words about justice that Jesus tells us are in the parables and their stories, and the kingdom of God is like, or we hear about the workers in the vineyard, or we hear about the parables of the talent, and we have this like conversation with ourselves about where does justice lie, and it's not always very obvious, and a lot of the time it's kind of turning things on their heads, perhaps even to us today. We might like to think we're on one side, and then we hear the parable again and we think, where were we there? Oh dear. And so there is this sense of the kind of counterintuitive nature of justice within the Bible. So
Mm,
I would be cautious about having a long line of prophets and, there's Rachel at the end of it, as it were, because I think we're all kind of searching for it.
mm,
Everything we're saying is hoping to move towards it, is listening, is seeking, has to be provisional, and
mm,
is kind of guided by what we see in the Bible and what we are learning. But one of the reasons that this new project that I'm working on around justice is around being a justice seeking church, is because we are seeking,
mm. I love
and
that.
recognizing that we are human and we are
Yeah.
seeking God's justice.
So there's, even as we take steps in courage and take steps in strength and try to act, there's also a, I don't know if you'd use this word or not, but a humility or a provisionality. So it's both
Yeah,
strength and vulnerability all rolled into one.
yeah.
You know,
But you wouldn't want it to stop you doing anything.
yeah.
There is the danger if you think kind of it is so provisional, we can never know anything,
Mm,
therefore I'll just wait and it'll
mm,
all come good in the end. We'll leave it to God. God will sort it out.
mm,
And I don't think that's what we're called to do.
yeah.
We are given a place here to join in.
Amen. I think when I hear that word justice, I think sometimes people have that I'm talking to, maybe who are not part of kind of faith traditions, or maybe are part of faith traditions, when they hear the word justice, maybe they think of criminal justice. They think of, someone being sent away to be rehabilitated, or someone who's made an offense to being punished. And I wonder, I don't think that's what you mean by justice. I wonder, could you just break down for someone maybe who this concept is a new one? What does justice kind of mean? Or maybe you
Mm,
want to describe it saying it was a picture in the Bible. What are some of the things we might see if we're seeing justice coming into being?
mm. That's a great question. We almost need to take a step back and say that within the whole world, not just the church, that justice is something that's contested. Justice is something that is a slippery word. You're
Mm.
never going to get somebody who says I'm against justice.
Mm.
We all like fairness, we all like justice. We just have different
Oh,
understandings of what it's about. And political philosophers have followed different routes. So some people will say that justice is about prioritizing prosperity or welfare. That is the most just outcome you can seek. Others would say it's about prioritizing the liberty of the individual. So that
okay.
is the most just thing. And then others would say actually it's about virtue. It's about building up the kind of character that leads to a just world. And those are the different lenses for justice that we look through. Within the church, sometimes Christians would again follow the libertarian route or a more liberal route, and then within explicitly contextual theologies, it's often about liberation for the oppressed. So
Mm.
within society, within the world, we have a different understanding of what this notion of justice and fairness is about. I think there are three words that we can choose from the Bible that might help us. The first one is about shalom. Shalom is not just about peace, which is sometimes the straight translation we do. It's about a rightness,
Mm.
things being right with God, and that is about our relationship being right with God. But it's also about everything within a person's condition being right. So if somebody is being oppressed, shalom does not exist.
Mm.
So
Mm.
it is this sense of being right, first of all. Secondly is a kind of a sense of covenant. So when you get the prophets in the Bible condemning the leaders for mistreating the poor and the widow and the orphan, it's because they've forgotten God's covenant.
Mm.
And that's why they're doing it. The prophets are hauling the leaders back to the covenant because the covenant is founded in relationship. So justice has to be about right relationships as well. So it's about a rightness of being, and it's about rightness of relationships. And then the third one for me is about restoration. As you say, some people will immediately jump to criminal justice, and that's often seen as punishment. And we do hear in the Old Testament, particularly about this, the kind of the punishments that threaten to people for disobeying God. But actually also we hear about the restoration, that things can be put right. And that gives us the kind of the forward hope as well. It's not up to us to put it right.
Mm,
Actually, in God's time, things will be restored and made right.
mm.
So those are three kind of biblical ideas. There are many more that for me help dig into the kind of the deeper understanding of what justice
Yeah.
might look like for us. Doesn't mean it's easy.
Oh, no,
And
that's,
looking at any one situation, you will have different Christians approaching it in different ways, still drawing on the same biblical texts. And we
yeah.
have to remember how biblical texts were misused to say that slavery was just
Yeah.
only a couple of hundred years ago.
So we're back to courage and humility, sort of back
Yeah.
to that kind of those lenses of take a step, but also, be honest that your interpretation is but one.
Yeah.
That's so helpful to you walking us through that kind of a quick snapshot of that biblical tradition. That's really, really helpful. Is there like just in the past 20 years or in the past few years, could you give us a picture of maybe what justice has looked like in a local community, or in a region, so something people could sort of get in their mind's eye, like, oh, this is a picture of what justice looks like in a community, maybe of a church doing something with others, or maybe it's people outside of who are not part of organized religion, doing something beautiful. Is give us
there are so many examples, and it's going to be difficult to pick one. One that I think you would probably appreciate from your own background is the work that has been done, particularly through Telco in East London, where churches and faith groups got together with citizens organising groups to work together on particular issues that affected their local community. And these were things that particularly around the living wage, around fair payment for people. And it was churches recognising that their community was not right. People were suffering, and identifying the causes for that. And then instead of only sticking plaster on it, which is really necessary because sometimes we bleed to death if we don't have sticking plasters or bandages, was actually saying, how strategically do we try and bring about this change? Who do we need to be working with? Who do we work alongside? And the people who were being paid least were the ones who were the spokespeople who were speaking up. And so from a very kind of small place of trying to work with local employers, this movement was building up, and eventually the living wage campaign came into being and has been adopted by companies and by public bodies all around the country. And you'll be pleased to know the Methodist Church was the first denominational or faith group living wage employer, and our investment arm, the Central Finance Board, helps to put pressure on companies that it invests in to move them towards being living wage employers. So that started with a local community where churches worked alongside mosques and schools and trade unions to do something that was really big. So many other
really
cases
helpful.
that don't grow to that scale, but where you see, for example, some churches in Peterborough who were working as part of a series of night shelters around the country, around the city, helping homeless people during the winter. And the people at the night shelter would eventually move around the churches, and people would go and stay each one. So one night a week they would come to this church in Peterborough. And I went to visit them when I was vice president, and they said when it started they were really scared. They didn't know what they were getting. They were getting homeless people coming to sleep in their church. They didn't know what was going to happen. And when I went to visit them, they knew them by name. They saw them when they were out in the streets. They welcomed them. The tables had tablecloths and flowers on. They sat with each other and talked. They'd got the local council involved. They got referrals. People had started moving on into homes. And the people in the church said, we have been changed by this experience. It's not just been about us doing things to people or helping people. Actually, we have been changed. This has been something we've taken part in. And I think if we're describing what justice is, it's never something that one part does to another part.
Yeah.
It is something that emerges and that we're all called to take part in.
Yeah, and the whole community, the system, the whole connected communities are shifted because of this wave that's coming from God and from our cooperating with God. I love that. I love that. Those are great examples, and I think it's so helpful, because I think sometimes you talk about putting plasters on, and so I think sometimes we sort of say, oh, that's not important, but you're saying actually that's really, really important, but it's only part of the conversation. There's, doing things like food banks and emergency shelters are so important. And it's sad to say that even more important these days, where the need for those things, because of some decisions that are happening in our welfare system, is, the need for those is much higher. And you're saying it's not just creating those kinds of communities, but also addressing the structural needs, so that perhaps over time these things are needed less. Is that right?
I think that's absolutely right. And it makes me so impressed when you see churches that have been involved in delivering food banks saying, but why are people hungry? And moving from food banks to develop things like community kitchens, where it's people deliver them to each other. It's not just being delivered through a food bank. And then they start campaigning for changes around, for example, the £20 uplift, and just see this kind of wider picture, that it's not just about a parcel of food, it's about relationships, but it is about structural change. But it's also about what the Methodist Church as a body can do. And there was a few years ago, we started hearing from food banks that people were being sanctioned, their benefits were being stopped as a punishment. And this was before people were talking about benefit sanctions. But the news came into the Joint Public Issues team that I worked from, just for intelligence, talking to people in food banks. So we started to do the research, and we found out all sorts of dreadful things that were happening, and we did the FOIs, the freedom of information requests, and so on. And we did all that work, and we found out what needed to be done, what needed to be changed, and we wrote a beautiful report, and nobody listened. Well, we did actually. We got a story on Radio 4. That was brilliant. But the MPs wouldn't listen. They wouldn't meet with us. But then at the same time, this report went out to people working in food banks, people in local churches, who raised it with their MPs. And then the MPs came back and said, actually, could we have a conversation about this? So it shows that doing that work on the ground, having that authenticity of knowing the people and knowing what's happening, being able to feed into a kind of a structural response, but then taking it back onto the ground and working through local MPs can be a really effective way of working for justice.
Absolutely beautiful. I'm sure if we had more than 45 minutes, you could tell us like innumerable stories of those kinds of stories from that you've heard while you've been privileged to be in the field listening to people. So, but thanks for those. Those are wonderful. So you mentioned the Methodist Church and our long history of being justice-seeking people and our kind of DNA and our tradition. And now you have this new role and a new project that you're convening, heading up, leading with lots of other folks. Could you just share just a little bit about that project and what its aims are? And maybe for people who are not Methodists, like what will be the difference if this project is successful in 10 years? Like what would we see different for the Methodist Church if this project gets really embedded?
Mm. Well, the project's called Walking with Micah. So it's picking up on one of these great Old Testament prophets, Prophet Micah, who said that again, channeling God, said to act
Mm,
justly, love kindness, and walk humbly with God.
mm.
Um, didn't just say that, said lots of other things as well, but that's the one that we're using as our kind of focus here. And the aim is to say, if we are a justice seeking church, which I believe that this is part of who we are called to be as a Methodist church, part of our history, part of our DNA, what does that mean for us? What does it mean practically?
Mm.
And what does it mean for us in terms of what we stand for? So this is a project that we're going to do over the next couple of years. We want to centre in it the voices of people who experience injustice.
Mm.
So we want to make sure that we hear those experiences of injustice, and that helps shape our understanding and what it is that we decide to do. But we also want to make sure that we do a deep listening exercise with Methodists around the country, but actually everybody else who wants to join in,
Mm.
and say, what do you think the most important thing is that we should be doing?
Mm.
What will it look like in our country, in our world, if we are a fair and just and more sustainable place to be? What do you think is the most important thing? So we want to gather that sense, those ideas. We also want to gather a sense of what people are already doing in their lives and in their churches. And the aim is that we will draw in we will learn from our history, from our theology, from the wider Methodist family, Methodist organizations and groups who are involved in doing this stuff on the ground. What difference will it make? Well, I hope and pray that it will mean that the Methodist Church has a clear sense and a clear articulation of
Mm.
its commitment to justice and what this means in the 2020s and 2030s. And so we can dedicate resources towards that and towards making a difference. I hope that for local churches and for local people, there is a really rekindled, re-embedded sense of the calling that's on all of us as disciples to be committed to justice and working for justice. And I hope that we will have clearer ways of actually doing this in our lives.
Yeah.
So in
Sounds like an
20 years' time,
amazing
Trey,
project.
should we come back together?
Let's come back together. At the end of our well, not the end of our
Working
lives,
lives.
hopefully. Yeah.
End of our working lives, maybe.
I know you're just the beginning of all these conversations, and I love that you're doing a deep consultation and centering the voices of those who've experiencing and are experiencing injustice. When you that's a great question. What's the most important thing that different folks want or long for, desire? I'm just curious. I know you're just the beginning, but what are some of the answers or responses you're hearing to that question when you ask people across the country, what's the most important thing for us? What is can you give us a little, is it too early to ask for a little foretaste?
It's almost a little bit too early, to be honest with you, Trey. But what I would like to do is to encourage people to move beyond the list. You know, it's very easy to list off. I bet you could do it now. 10 things,
Yeah.
10 issues. I'd like to really encourage people to move beyond the issues and say, this is the world now, this is the issues now, but what's the city on the hill look like?
Okay.
You know, what does justice look like? And if that's the case, what's the most important step we can take towards that in order to deal with these issues now?
Oh, I love
So
that.
we can't take all the steps, but for you, what would be that one step that you think would be the best one that we can take in order to reach your sense of what justice looks like?
I love it. So it's
So
going to
I'm
be,
almost going to throw it back to you.
I love it. I love it. So it's and I say it's complicated. I don't mean that in a negative way, but there's a lot to chew over. There's a lot of conversation to be had. There's a lot of listening and letting things kind of filter through. So we're not just sort of acting kind of impetuously or following our first whim. That's brilliant. Well, I shall look forward to journeying alongside you and thousands and thousands of others as we undertake this together. So wonderful. I wanted to I heard you give a talk a few years ago at a conference, and you were talking beautifully about the kind of the intertwining for Christians, at least, of social justice and evangelism, how intertwined and necessary they both are. And I think a lot of people are actually uncomfortable with both of those things in different ways. Some people are like, oh, I'm not a political, socially engaged, justice-seeking person, but I can talk about God. Or there are folks who are like, oh, I'm very politically engaged, I'm very justice-seeking, but I feel a little squeamish talking about God or sharing my faith. And what I heard you doing so beautifully in that talk was saying these things are fitted together, these things are intertwined. And I'm just curious, for the person who was maybe saying, I'm happy to talk about God, but I'll leave justice to other people, what would be your top tip to take a step in that direction? And maybe for someone who was on the other end of the spectrum, who was like, I'm happy to organize for justice, but I don't really want to think about spirituality or God in that. What would be your top tip for them? So I guess, what would be your top tips for people to come together and realize those things holding together?
Well, I'm going to start in the middle and we'll see what happens.
It's cool. I don't know the answer to this question
No.
either. So this is
I think for both kind of people, as it were, perhaps the best image to hold in our heads is one of wholeness. That's the one that works for me. And it is this idea that God longs for us to live life in all its fullness. I don't think that you can truly love somebody and not care a bit about a bit of their life. So you couldn't love somebody and not care they had toothache, or you couldn't love somebody and not care that they had particular views about, I don't know, something that was really, really important in your life. So if you love somebody, you actually care about the whole, and how much more so that must be for God. So I don't believe that God's love for us discounts or downplays any part of our lives where we're suffering. So perhaps I would say to somebody who couldn't deal with the political bit, that actually good news for somebody who is oppressed or experiencing climate change or anything like that has to be the whole good news. And what does that look like? Because it might look different to the way it is for other people, but it has to look like that. So I think that there is that kind of sense of wholeness that I would really call people to. And for somebody for whom the political stuff worked and they were squeamish about God, again, it's a sense of wholeness and the idea that we are, if we're talking about justice may be of God, but it is a route to, it is a way of, it is and not an end in itself. So if we are talking about wholeness, we've got to think about what the whole looks like. So I think that would be more of a challenge for them. But I think for all of us as a church, unless we are able to be authentic in how we're talking about the wholeness of God's love for all of us, and in communities we are talking about the impact of climate change, or we're talking about the removal of the £20 uplift. Otherwise, we will just be seen as, opting out. And I think this kind of authenticity and this wholeness that we are able to see and to hopefully reflect something of is probably the kind of the image that holds it together best for me.
Rachel, I really love that. It's seeing others and knowing ourselves as people who have all kinds of different longings, desires, needs. We are all heart, body, soul, strength. As the Bible talks about us, we are people with, and it's not just. That's how we all are. And so your top tip for anyone, I guess, in holding justice and evangelism together is pro whole people, towards whole people, be whole people, treat others as whole people. I love that. I love that. It's a great answer. I'll steal that one. I think folks, I've asked other folks this question on Hope and Anchor, but I'm going to ask you as well, because it's one that I hear from folks who are committed to change, committed to justice, both inside the church, the Methodist Church or the Church of Jesus Christ, but also within other religious traditions, and those folks who are secular, who are kind of not people of faith, but who are all committed to justice. I think one of the common experiences that people have is of burnout or fatigue. And I wonder what your advice as a person committed to faith, as a spiritual person, might be to all those folks. What's your advice as someone who's been in it for a while for staying in as a whole person, and not as a person who's, depleting oneself and giving away oneself so much that you're not sure who you are anymore. So how do you stay in the struggle as a whole person? Do you have any top tips for that?
It is a real challenge, that, Trey, and I think the kind of tips that I would give aren't necessarily the ones that would work for everyone. Perhaps they work for me. I think for me there's probably four. The importance of being part of a group, and that may be a self-defined group. So for me, the Joint Public Issues team over the past 10-15 years has been my group. They've been my group of people who we've got it. We are all committed. We are all in this. We are the highs and the lows together. So it is that sense of shared burden, shared identity. You hold each other up at the times when you need holding. You celebrate the highs. We put the lows. So it is that kind of being part of a group. That may be your church. It may be a kind of a house group or a group like that. It may not be, but for me, I think that's one. The second one is a profound recognition that God is bigger than you, and you're not going to do it all. There is a lovely quote that I read once that God's put you on earth to do one thing, and at the rate I'm going, I'm never going to die. But the question of what is yours to do is really important. You can't do it all, and sometimes it is okay to stop. It's okay to stop and watch Strictly, or it's okay to stop and just have time out with your family. Absolutely. And if you don't allow yourself time off and say, this isn't mine to do, I've done my bit for today, God's still there, God's still turning the earth. It's somebody else's turn for now. You need to know that. Thirdly is knowing what feeds you and finding new things. Now, you may be lucky enough that is your church community. It may be another place. It may be a particular form of spirituality that you express. It may be walks on top of mountains, which it often is for me when I can. But what is the thing that feeds you? Going away to Gladstone's library and staying there and reading hundreds of books as well. That's another thing that
sounds
feeds
like heaven.
Me. Yeah, it is. But finding those things that feed you and refresh you spiritually, intellectually, all sorts of different ways, and diarizing them, to use the American term, getting them in the diary and making sure you do them. And then the last one is about staying connected and staying authentic. If you are caring about a particular issue, how do you know that you are still talking about what's real? So some people I've worked with have volunteered, gone to work in kind of drop-in centres. Some people have gone to work in debt centres just as a volunteer. Volunteer in your local community, just keeping that bit of connection with what you are now campaigning for or whatever. If this is something you are living, or if it's something you're working on a daily basis, or if you're in a church and this is the community of which you are part, this is something you'll be connected to already. So I think the last one is probably pointed at people like me, who largely do their work through campaigning. But those are my
That's great.
tips.
The four top tips. So find people to do this with, to do life with, and spirituality with. Realize that God is bigger than you, and it's okay to do your one thing. Know what feeds you, what gives you life and joy. It's okay to stop and do that, and make a plan for it. And then staying authentic, staying in relationship on the ground with communities. Love it. That alone is worth the interview right there. The last little sign off, I'm really grateful for the extra time you've given today, is I just want to for you to imagine yourself outside the Houses of Parliament, and this is a question I'd asked actually the MP Emma Hardy earlier, but I wanted to ask you because I know you care about public policy and justice, and there's some debate going on, say, in the House of Commons around some sort of issue of justice that we're all fired up about. And you come out in the House of Commons as one among many, out into the Parliament Square, one among many, and thousands of people there, multi-faith, people of no faith, all rallying for justice. And when someone spots you and says, "That's Rachel Lampard, we know her, pull her up on stage," and they get you up on stage for some reason, and they say, "Rachel, before we go back to our neighborhoods and our cities and our villages and our states and our places all over Britain, could you just give us a word, a benediction, a challenge to be people of justice as we go back to our places?" And you have like a couple sentences. What would you say to send them, all these lovely, beautiful, diverse folks, to send them into the world?
I'd probably say I need a minute just to think about it, actually.
It's good. That's good. They would laugh and wait with you. You know, that's wonderful.
I think I would say that wherever you are and whoever you are called to do something for justice. It might be large, it might be small, but that's yours, and it's yours to do. And you might not see the outcome of it next week or next year or in your lifetime, but you will have done it, and you will have done your bit towards the arc towards justice that Martin Luther King spoke about. And I think that's all that we can do, be part of that.
I honestly felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That's a good word, at least to me, and I'm sure it would be to all of them. Rachel Lampard, thank you so much for being with us today on Hope and Anchor. It's been a real joy.
It's been my pleasure, Trey. Thank you.